They were told the Americans would never take them alive. They were told capture meant shame violation and a death worse than any battlefield could offer. So when the sky over Saipan stopped shaking in the first week of July 1944, Nurse Fumiko Tanaka believed the silence was only the beginning of something far more terrible than the bombs. She was 24 years old, trained at Nagasaki General Hospital, posted to the field medical station at the base of Mount Tapochau. For 3 months, she had wrapped shattered limbs with strips torn from old uniforms and whispered prayers that the smell of rot would not draw the flies before sunrise. The morphine had run out a month ago. The sulfa powder vanished 2 weeks after that. All she had left was boiled water torn cloth in her hands. But what Fumiko did not know, what no one inside that cave could possibly know, was that in 3 days, a man with a pair of scissors would kneel before her on a beach, and the thing he did next would save her life, destroy everything she believed, and 40 years later, bring her granddaughter to lay a single white flower at the grave of an American she had never met. To understand how that moment came to be, we need to go back to the morning the world collapsed around her. The field hospital was not a hospital. It was a cave carved into the volcanic rock beneath the highest point on the island, a space no wider than a schoolroom, lit by oil lamps whose flames bent with every distant explosion. The wounded lay on mats of palm leaves. Some moaned, some had stopped moaning days ago, and simply stared at the stone ceiling with eyes that no longer blinked. Fumiko moved between them in the amber light, checking pulses she already knew were fading, rewrapping bandages that had turned the color of rust. The smell was the thing she could never forget. Antiseptic mixed with decay layered over the damp mineral breath of the cave itself. It coated her tongue when she breathed through her mouth. It soaked into her hair. At night, when the shelling paused, she could hear rats moving in the darkness and the soft, wet sound of flies settling on wounds she could no longer keep clean. Outside, the Americans were closing in. Every day, the artillery sounded closer. Every night, fewer runners returned with reports. The radio had gone silent 2 days ago. No orders came from headquarters. No supplies. No hope. Just the slow tightening of a fist around an island that was already broken. Fumiko worked alongside 7 other women from the medical unit. Most were young. One, a girl named Keiko, had just turned 17 and still flinched at the sound of mortar fire. But the woman Fumiko watched most carefully was not young and did not flinch at anything. Sachiko Mori was 28, a former radio communications operator who had been reassigned to medical support when the front lines collapsed. She outranked Fumiko. She carried herself with the rigid posture of someone who had memorized every word of the imperial code and intended to die by it. Every night when the lamps burned low, Sachiko reminded the women of their duty. "If they come for us," she said, her voice flat as a blade on stone, "we know what to do. We are daughters of Japan. We do not surrender. We do not beg." She kept a razor blade in her breast pocket. She called it her final insurance. That night, Fumiko lay awake listening to the shelling. Somewhere beyond the ridge, American voices carried on the wind, sharp and young and foreign. She thought of her mother in Nagasaki hanging laundry in the garden behind the wooden house. She thought of the propaganda posters that lined every corridor of the hospital where she trained. American devils with fangs, women screaming in their claws, children torn apart. She had believed those posters once. Part of her still did. But another part, the part that had spent 3 months watching men die from infections that clean gauze could have prevented, that part was too tired to believe in anything except the next breath. She did not know it yet, but that exhaustion would save her life. On the morning of July 7th, 1944, a bugle sounded before dawn. Fumiko sat upright on her mat. The sound was not American, it was Japanese. And it meant only one thing. Through the cave entrance, she heard the cry that would echo across the Pacific for generations. "Tenno Heika Banzai, long live the Emperor." The voices rose from every ridge and hollow, thousands of them, rolling toward the American lines like a wave made of human throats. The Banzai charge at Saipan would become the largest of the entire war. Nearly 4,000 Japanese soldiers, many armed with nothing but bayonets and swords, hurled themselves against American machine gun positions in a final act of obedience to their dying commander, Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, who had ordered the attack before taking his own life. Fumiko did not see the charge. She heard it. The roar of voices, then the hammering of American guns, continuous, mechanical, relentless, like a sound that would never stop. And then the wounded began arriving, not carried on stretchers, not brought by medics. They crawled. They dragged themselves through the cave entrance, leaving trails of blood on the stone floor, like the tracks of broken animals returning to a den that could no longer shelter them. She worked for 16 hours without pause. When the gauze ran out, she tore the lining from her own jacket. When the water ran out, she used saliva to clean wounds. When a soldier's hand went cold in hers, she closed his eyes and moved to the next mat without a word, because words cost time, and time was the only currency that mattered. Sometime past midnight, a sound reached her from outside the cave. Not Japanese. English. A voice young and cracked with pain, calling out in a language she had been taught to hate. Fumiko froze. Every instinct told her to stay inside. That voice belonged to the enemy. The enemy who had killed the men on her mats. The enemy whose machine guns had not stopped firing for 16 hours. But she was a nurse, and a nurse does not choose whose blood she stops. She crawled to the cave entrance and looked out. Moonlight turned the rocks silver. 20 yards away, sprawled between two boulders, an American Marine lay face up. He was young, barely more than a boy, with sandy hair, matted dark with blood. A piece of shrapnel had torn through his abdomen. His intestines glistened in the pale light. His name was Corporal Billy Dawson. He was 19 years old from a ranch outside San Antonio, Texas. He had been in the Pacific for 4 months and had written his mother 6 letters, each one ending with the same line, "Don't worry about me, I'm too stubborn to die." Fumiko looked around. No one was watching. She could go back inside. She could let the night finish what the shrapnel had started. Instead, she crawled to him. She pressed his intestines back into the wound cavity with her bare hands. She bound the opening with a strip of cloth torn from the head wrap she had worn since Saipan's rainy season began. Her fingers worked by memory, by training, by something deeper than either. Billy looked up at her with eyes glazed by shock and agony. He did not understand why the enemy was saving him. He could not have understood. But he felt her hands steady and warm, and he stopped screaming. Fumiko did not know that the boy she had just saved would become the only witness who could protect her from a fate she had not yet imagined. That knowledge lay months in the future, hidden like a letter that takes years to arrive. By morning, the guns had fallen silent. The Banzai charge was over. The Japanese garrison on Saipan was destroyed. And in the cave, Sachiko Mori stood at the entrance with her razor blade catching the first light of dawn. "It is time," she said. Fumiko looked at the women around her. 8 faces in the dimness. Some were crying. Keiko, the 17-year-old, shook so violently her teeth chattered. Sachiko turned the blade slowly in her fingers. Her eyes held no fear, only certainty. "We are daughters of the Emperor," Sachiko said. "We will not give the American devils the satisfaction." Before she could say more, American voices erupted from the tree line. Loudspeakers crackled. A translator, his Japanese halting but clear, called out, "Do not be afraid. You will not be harmed. Come out slowly." Sachiko's hand tightened on the blade. She turned to Fumiko. "Help them," she said. "You are a nurse. You know how to make it painless." Fumiko's heart slammed against her ribs. The cave walls seemed to close in. She smelled blood and stone and fear, and the faint sweetness of the palm mats where men had died. "No," she said. The word fell like a stone into still water. Sachiko's eyes narrowed. "What did you say?" "I said no, we do not know what will happen. Until now they have not heard us. They have not even fired into the cave." "That is the trap," Sachiko hissed. "Fatten us with hope, then slaughter us. The posters told us what they do to women." "The posters were made by men who are dead now," Fumiko said, and the words surprised her as much as anyone. "I am a nurse. My job is to keep people alive, not help them die." The silence stretched like wire between them. Then the Marines entered the cave. The blade was taken from Sachiko's hand before she could use it. The women were led out into the morning light, stumbling, blinking their legs weak from days underground. But as they walked past Fumiko, Sachiko turned her head and spoke so only she could hear. "This is not over." And Fumiko knew she was right. Outside, the beach shimmered under brutal sun. Wrecked landing craft lay half buried in the sand. Smoke still drifted from the hills, where the Banzai charge had spent itself against American steel. The air smelled of salt and gunpowder, and something sweet and terrible that Fumiko would later learn was the smell of a battlefield after the flies have come. A tall man waited beside a jeep. He was not armed. His sleeves were rolled up to the elbows, his forearms sunburned to the color of clay, his eyes hidden behind round spectacles. A Red Cross armband circled his left bicep. A medical kit lay open on the jeep's hood, instruments gleaming in the sunlight. Lieutenant James Whitfield, United States Navy Medical Corps, was 31 years old, born and raised on the south side of Chicago, where his father ran a hardware store and his mother taught piano to children who could not afford their own instruments. He had graduated from Rush Medical College in 1938 and completed his residency in surgery at Cook County Hospital, where he had learned to work fast, stay calm, and treat whatever walked through the door without asking questions that were not medical. He looked over the group of women quickly. His gaze was clinical, not curious. It moved across faces, hands, posture, and stopped at Fumiko's left thigh. The blood had soaked through her uniform and dried black, gluing the fabric to her skin from hip to knee. A piece of mortar shrapnel had torn through the muscle 2 days earlier. She had cleaned it once with canteen water and wrapped it with the last clean gauze in the cave. Every step since had ripped the wound open again. She had tried not to limp, afraid it would mark her as weak. Whitfield pointed at her leg, then at the stretcher on the jeep. She shook her head, misunderstanding, clutching the torn fabric of her uniform with both hands. The translator stepped forward. Corporal George Hayashi was Nisei's second-generation Japanese-American, born in Honolulu, trained at the Military Intelligence Service Language School at Camp Savage, Minnesota. His family was in Manzanar, the internment camp in California's Owens Valley. He spoke Japanese with a Hawaiian accent that softened the consonants and stretched the vowels, giving even harsh words a musical quality. "He wants to treat you," Hayashi said in Japanese. "You are hurt." Fumiko heard treat and hurt and thought interrogate. When Whitfield stepped forward, she flinched. He crouched, studying the dark stains spreading down her leg. He murmured something to Hayashi. "She will lose the leg if we wait," the translator said. Whitfield pulled a pair of scissors from his field kit. He held them up so she could see the blades turning them slowly in the sunlight, the way a man shows a frightened animal that the thing in his hand is not a weapon. He pointed at the blood-stiffened fabric. "Cut," he said slowly. "I must cut." She shook her head violently. In her mind, the posters blazed. American devils tearing clothes from Japanese women. She knew what came next. Everyone knew. Whitfield knelt and slipped the scissors under the edge of her torn uniform. Fumiko screamed. The Marines jerked upright. One raised his rifle instinctively. The sound of a weapon being shouldered cut through the morning air like a second scream. She swung her fist, caught Whitfield's shoulder, stumbled backward, and fell in the sand. The movement tore the wound wide open. Blood welled bright through the old fabric, vivid and wrong against the white sand. For a heartbeat, everyone froze. The woman sprawled and bleeding. The Marines tense. The doctor halfway between command and compassion, his scissors lying where they had fallen, catching the sun. Then Whitfield did the only thing he could. He dropped everything. He raised both hands, palms open, fingers spread, and held them in the air where she could see them. Empty hands, no blade, no weapon, no threat, just skin and sunlight. "Medkit," he called without lowering his arms. "Bandage, now." Hayashi ran to him with the green medical pouch. Whitfield opened it deliberately, slowly, where she could see every item. Gauze, antiseptic powder, forceps gleaming like tiny silver fish. He laid each one on the sand in front of her, the way a man lays out an offering. Then he poured iodine onto a pad. The sharp hospital smell cut through the salt air, and something in Fumiko's chest shifted. She knew that smell. She had lived inside that smell for 3 months. It was the smell of trying to save a life. Whitfield pressed the pad against his own forearm to demonstrate. "Stop bleeding," he said through Hayashi. "You hit me. I am not angry. Let me help." Fumiko stared, chest heaving. Her eyes moved from the iodine pad to his raised hands to the gauze laid out on the sand like a prayer answered in the wrong language. Then she nodded. Once, trembling. Whitfield approached again, moving the way a man soothes a horse that has been beaten by other men. He cut the fabric cleanly, peeling it from the wound. The sound of cloth tearing from dried blood made every Marine wince. He worked quickly, rinsing with canteen, water sprinkling sulfa powder, wrapping fresh gauze tight above the gash. When he tied the bandage off, his forearms were streaked with her blood. He looked up, met her eyes, and said a single word she did not need translated. Okay, Fumiko blinked. For the first time since the invasion began, she saw no hatred in an enemy's face. Only exhaustion, only focus, and something almost like mercy. She did not know his name yet. She only knew that he had touched her wound with gentleness, not greed, and that somehow was harder to bear than anything the war had done to her. That night, loaded onto a truck heading south toward the beach, Fumiko sat wedged between Keiko and another nurse. Her leg throbbed but clean. The torn fabric of her uniform fluttered against the fresh gauze. In her mind, the same image replayed. The moment the doctor's hands stopped her bleeding instead of her life. The moment his palms opened in the sunlight like two white flags that meant something more complicated than surrender. She did not trust him. Not yet. Not fully. But somewhere beneath the fear, hidden even from herself, she felt the smallest pulse of something she could not name. Not gratitude, not faith, just curiosity. The dangerous world-breaking kind. What if the enemy's kindness was real? What if survival meant learning to see them as human? The truck rumbled toward the shore. Behind her, Saipan smoldered under stars. Ahead, a transport ship waited in the dark water, its lights reflected on the surface like a city that existed only at night. And somewhere in the back of the truck, invisible in the darkness, Sachiko Mori sat perfectly still, her empty hand curled around the place where the razor blade had been, her eyes fixed on Fumiko's silhouette with an expression that was not anger, not grief, but something far more dangerous. Patience. But Fumiko did not know what Sachiko was planning. She did not know that the doctor who saved her carried a photograph of a dead brother in his breast pocket and fought a private war every time he bandaged a Japanese wound. She did not know that a master sergeant named Brennan was already writing reports that could send her to an interrogation facility she might never leave. And she did not know that the boy she had saved on the rocks, the Texas corporal with his intestines in her hands, would one day stand in a military office and say 3 words that changed everything. All she knew was that her leg was wrapped in clean gauze, that the stars were bright, and that for the first time in 1,096 days, she was not certain her enemies wanted her dead. And that uncertainty, fragile as gauze, thin as a razor's edge, was the first crack in a wall of hatred that had taken an empire to build. The transport ship smelled of diesel and disinfectant and the ghosts of 1,000 wounded men who had lain on its decks before. Below the waterline, in a hold that hummed with engine vibration, rows of cots stretched from bulkhead to bulkhead, like beds in a hospital ward that happened to be floating across the Pacific Ocean. Sailors carried buckets of fresh water. Doctors shouted orders. Everywhere there was motion, organized, impersonal, efficient, a machine built for the business of keeping broken people alive long enough to reach the next island. And Fumiko lay on her cot and studied the ceiling. Metal rivets, condensation beating on cold steel. The gentle roll of the ship through calm seas. It was nothing like the cave on Saipan, where the ceiling was stone and the air tasted of blood. Here the air tasted of iodine and boiled coffee and something she could not identify until much later. Soap. The ship smelled of soap. She had not smelled soap in 3 months. Lieutenant Whitfield moved among the wounded with his clipboard sleeves rolled to the elbows, as always spectacles slightly fogged from the humidity below deck. When he reached Fumiko's cot, she tried to sit up, but pain shot through her thigh like a hot wire. He gestured for her to stay still. "No move," he said softly. "Rest." Then turning to Hayashi, "Tell her the bleeding has stopped, but we will need to check for infection when we reach Guam." Hayashi repeated the words. Fumiko listened, half understanding. The word infection, she knew. She had whispered it over too many dying soldiers in the cave. She nodded. "Arigato," she said. Her accent made it soft, almost musical, the sound of a word she had never expected to say to an American. Whitfield looked up, surprised. For a moment, something passed across his face that was not medical and not military. Then it was gone. "You're welcome," he said, though she could not know the words. Days blurred into light and darkness. American nurses came often checking pulses, replacing bandages, offering broth. Some prisoners refused to eat, certain it was poison. Fumiko forced herself to sip tasting salt and meat for the first time in weeks. At night, she dreamed of scissors glinting in sunlight and woke trembling until she remembered the gauze around her leg. Each morning, she expected cruelty, and each morning none came. The sailors saluted their officers, carried the wounded, gently joked among themselves in English that sounded to her like music played on unfamiliar instruments. She could not understand the words, but she understood the tone. These were men trying to forget the war, not men planning atrocities. When Guam appeared on the horizon, a green rise out of blue water, the prisoners crowded the rails. Fumiko watched from her cot as the island grew larger. She thought of what lay behind her. Saipan, the cave, the dead, and she thought of what lay ahead, which was nothing she could name or predict. But Fumiko did not know that the doctor who had saved her carried a secret that could have made him her executioner instead of her healer. That secret sat in his breast pocket, folded inside a photograph of a boy who would never grow old. And that letter, the one she would not receive for 7 years, was already being written in the silences between Whitfield's heartbeats, one word at a time, in a language she had not yet learned to read. Guam smelled of rain and fuel. The USS Transport dropped anchor in Opera Harbor under a sky scrubbed clean by storms. American flags rippled on the shoreline, and behind them rose a forest of white hospital tents, stretching toward the hills like a second invasion. Only this time the soldiers carried stretchers instead of rifles. The prisoners were unloaded in silence. Marines guided them down the gangway. No shouting, no blows. Fumiko limped through puddles, her leg wrapped in clean gauze that still felt too pure for her skin. When her sandals sank in the mud, an American nurse caught her arm before she could fall. "Careful," the woman said softly. Words Fumiko did not understand, but tone she did. It was the voice one used for the sick, not the defeated. Inside the tent, the air was heavy with antiseptic. Rows of cots glowed under hanging lamps. A phonograph somewhere played an American tune light and careless a sound from a world that had not been bombed. Fumiko sat on a cot and clutched the edges of the blanket like armor, waiting for whatever came next. What came next was penicillin. Hayashi explained it carefully. "They will give you medicine for infection. Penicillin." Fumiko blinked. She had heard rumors of that drug among the surgeons on Saipan. Miracle powder that cut fever in a day. Japan had never had enough. She thought it was legend, something invented by propaganda to explain why American wounded survived and Japanese wounded died. "Honto," she whispered. "Really, really." A nurse rolled a cart beside the bed. Bottles clinked labels in English. She prepared a syringe while Whitfield checked Fumiko's pulse. His fingers were professional, impersonal, but her heart still hammered against his touch. She wanted to pull away. She forced herself still. The needle stung. Warmth spread up her arm like sunlight entering a cold room, one window at a time. That night, for the first time in months, the pain in her thigh dulled to a low murmur. The fever that had crept along the edges of her consciousness for days receded like a tide pulling back from shore. She slept without dreaming of bombs. Morning brought something more dangerous than medicine. It brought food, bowls of rice porridge, tinned fruit, something that looked like soup with vegetables floating in golden broth. The Japanese women stared at the food as if it might explode. No one touched it. The Americans watched patiently until a nurse, a red-haired girl from Iowa named Margaret O'Brien, whom everyone called Meg, sat down beside them, took a spoonful from her own bowl, and smiled. She chewed. She swallowed. She grinned and gave a thumbs up. Only then did the prisoners lift their spoons. Fumiko tasted sweetness, peach syrup. The fruit was soft and cold, and impossibly sweet, like eating a memory of peacetime. She closed her eyes. Years had passed since she had tasted anything that was not smoke or salt or the metallic tang of fear. The syrup coated her tongue, and something cracked inside her chest, not bone, not cartilage, but something structural nonetheless. A wall. The first brick loosening. She did not cry. She had forgotten how. But she held the spoon very still for a long time, and Meg, watching from across the tent, said nothing and smiled a little less brightly because she recognized the expression. She had seen it on the faces of liberated prisoners before. The look of someone tasting kindness for the first time and not knowing whether it was safe to swallow. But that sweet morning was the last peaceful one for a long time, because that night Sachiko Mori would begin her plan. A week passed. Fumiko's leg healed. She began helping the nurses fold bandages, instinct overriding caution. Her hands remembering their training even when her mind told her to stay invisible. Meg noticed first. She watched Fumiko roll a dressing tighter and more efficiently than any trainee she had supervised in 18 months of Pacific nursing. Good, Meg said, giving a thumbs up. Fumiko hesitated, then mimicked the gesture. The whole tent laughed quietly, and, for the first time since the surrender, laughter did not sound like betrayal. But with returning health came guilt that sat in her stomach like a stone. Letters from home filtered through the Red Cross. They spoke of starvation, cities burned, families vanished. Fumiko read them under the dim tent light and felt her insides twist. She was eating American peaches while her country starved. She was healing because the enemy had decided she deserved to live. On the fifth night at Guam, Fumiko woke to whispering. The tent was dark except for moonlight seeping through the canvas seams. At the far end, in the deepest shadow, Sachiko Mori knelt among the women. Her voice was low but carried the weight of absolute conviction, each word placed like a brick in a wall she was building around their fear. Listen to me. We have lived too long in disgrace. Every day we eat their rice is a day we betray the emperor. I have found a way. The rock ledge north of the camp. The guards change shift at 3 in the morning. There are 30 seconds when no one watches. Enough for all of us. Silence. Keiko began to cry, muffling the sound with her fist pressed against her mouth. Sachiko turned to Fumiko. In the half-darkness, her eyes were flat and certain the eyes of someone who had already crossed a line and was waiting for the others to follow. You are a nurse. You know how to make death painless. Help them. The words hit Fumiko like shrapnel. Inside her skull, images collided. Propaganda posters of American demons. Officers screaming orders to die with honor. The cliffs of Saipan where mothers had held their children and jumped rather than be captured. She had believed in that honor once. A part of her still did. The part trained since childhood to obey, to sacrifice, to consider individual survival a form of cowardice. But another part of her, the part that had felt Whitfield's steady hands on her wound, the part that had tasted peach syrup and heard an Iowa girl laugh, the part that had watched American sailors carry Japanese wounded with the same care they carried their own, that part rose up inside her like a second voice she had not known she possessed. No, Fumiko said. The syllable fell into the darkness like a match struck in a cave. Sachiko's jaw tightened. What? I said no, we do not know what they will do with us. So far they have only treated us, fed us, given us medicine. Sachiko stepped closer. Her face in the moonlight was stone. That is the tactic. Fatten the cattle before the slaughter. You think they give us penicillin for free? Everything has a price, and the price will be our bodies. Then let us wait and see what the price is, Fumiko said, her voice shaking but clear. I was on Saipan. I saw their doctor cut my uniform, and I thought he would violate me. Instead, he saved my leg. He used their most precious medicine on an enemy. I do not say they are good. I say we do not know enough to die. Sachiko laughed. The sound had no warmth. You have been tamed. Peaches and penicillin and a gentle doctor. You have forgotten what you are. I have not forgotten, Fumiko said louder than she intended, loud enough that Keiko stopped crying and looked up. I am one nurse. My job is to keep people alive, not to help them die. Silence filled the tent like water filling a sinking ship. Sachiko turned away. Anyone who wants to follow me, be at the North Ledge at 2:45. Anyone who wants to live like the enemy's pet can stay here with Tanaka. She walked back to her cot without another word. In the darkness, Fumiko lay still, counting heartbeats, counting breaths, trying to determine from the small sounds of the tent who would go and who would stay. At 2:40 in the morning, she saw 3 shadows slip from their cots and move toward the tent flap. One of them was Keiko. Fumiko had 90 seconds to decide, follow them or save them. She chose. She ran barefoot into the night, her wounded thigh screaming with every stride, the gauze damp with sweat. The camp was quiet. Distant generators hummed. A single searchlight swept the perimeter in slow arcs, painting the ground with circles of white that appeared and vanished like ghosts. She found them at the North Ledge. The rock dropped 40 feet to black water and coral below. Waves slapped against the stone with a sound like slow applause. Sachiko stood at the very edge, her face turned toward the ocean, her arms at her sides. Behind her stood the 3 women. Keiko was trembling so badly she could barely stand. Sachiko, Fumiko called. Stop! Sachiko turned. In the moonlight, her expression was not angry. It was peaceful. The peace of someone who has already decided and no longer carries the weight of choosing. Did you come to follow or to interfere? To interfere. Then you are a traitor. Maybe, but I am a living traitor, and so are you for now. Fumiko stepped closer. The rocks cut into her bare feet. She felt blood on her soles but did not look down. If you die here, Sachiko, who will know? You think the Emperor will hear about it? You think anyone will carve your name on a stone numb? Your body will wash away with the tide, and an American clerk will write prisoner suicide in a report, and that will be all there is. You will not be a hero. You will be a statistic. Honor does not need an audience, Sachiko said. But life does, Fumiko replied. Life needs witnesses. If you die, who will tell the world what happened on Saipan? Who will tell your daughter what her mother was? Sachiko flinched. The first crack. Tiny, almost invisible, but there. I have no daughter, she said quietly. Not yet, Fumiko said. Not yet. Keiko stepped back from the edge. Then the second woman. The third hesitated, looked at Sachiko, looked at the sea, and stepped back. Sachiko stood alone on the rim of the rock. Below her, the Pacific breathed. Above her, the stars burned in patterns older than any war. For a long moment, she did not move. Fumiko held out her hand. Sachiko looked at it, looked at the ocean, looked back at the hand. She did not take it, but she stepped off the ledge, inland, away from the edge. It was not reconciliation. Sachiko would carry her contempt for Fumiko like a scar for years. But she had chosen to live if only for tonight, and tonight was enough. They walked back to the tent in silence. Fumiko's feet left bloody prints on the path. She did not feel them. She felt only the shaking in her legs and the hammering of her heart, and a strange, terrible pride that tasted nothing like the honor she had been taught. By morning, Master Sergeant Roy Brennan had found the footprints on the rock. He knew something had happened. He added a note to his file. Tanaka displays influence over prisoner group. Monitor closely. Brennan was 45 years old with silver hair cropped close and gray eyes that missed nothing. He was responsible for security of the prisoner compound at Guam. His son, Private First Class Eddie Brennan, had died at the Battle of Tarawa in November 1943, one of the bloodiest amphibious assaults the Marines had ever attempted. Over 1,000 Americans killed in 76 hours on an atoll so small you could walk across it in 20 minutes. Brennan did not beat prisoners. He did not scream or threaten or violate the Geneva Convention in any way that could be documented. He did something far more dangerous. He built cases. He wrote reports. He conducted what he called security assessments, interviewing prisoners with the calm precision of an accountant, auditing a ledger, searching for inconsistencies, for signs of intelligence training, for anything that could justify transferring a prisoner to a harsher facility where the questions would be less polite and the answers more painful. He did this not because he was cruel. He did this because his son was dead and the world owed him an explanation, and if the world would not provide one, he would construct his own from paperwork and regulations and the cold satisfaction of knowing that the system at least still functioned. But Fumiko did not know about Brennan's investigation. Not yet. She was learning something else entirely. In the weeks that followed, she watched Whitfield work. She observed how he checked wounds, how he read vital signs, how he made decisions under pressure with a calm that seemed almost inhuman until you noticed the way his hands trembled when he thought no one was looking. She studied the American nurses and memorized their techniques: pressure bandaging, capillary refill checks, infection monitoring, drain placement. Things she had never learned on Saipan because on Saipan the only medical philosophy was keep working until the patient dies or the supplies run out, whichever comes first. She began to understand that medicine could be more than triage. It could be architecture. You could build a system of care that anticipated problems before they arrived, that treated the body as a structure to be supported rather than a ruin to be salvaged. And then the letter arrived in Brennan's hands. Not from the front, from the intelligence office. The file read Tanaka Fumiko, born Nagasaki 1920, trained Nagasaki General Hospital 1938 to 1941. First assignment Naval Hospital Yokosuka, 1942 to 1943, transferred to Radio Communications Unit for basic training in Morse code and wireless equipment operation before returning to medical duties. 1943, reassigned to Field Medical Unit Saipan. Brennan read the words Radio Communications Unit, and his eyes went still in a way that reminded no one of his son and everyone of a hunter. He took the file to the camp commander's office. He placed it on the desk with the care of a man presenting evidence in a court. Captain Prisoner Tanaka Fumiko is not just a nurse. Her record shows assignment to a radio communications unit. She has knowledge of encryption and wireless equipment. Under Prisoner Interrogation Regulation, Section 3, Paragraph 7, she qualifies for transfer to a specialized interrogation facility at Pearl Harbor. The captain looked at the file. She seems like a nurse Brennan. With intelligence training, sir, and she has been influencing the prisoner group. 2 weeks ago, there was a nocturnal security incident at the North Perimeter that I documented in my July 14th report. The captain frowned. I will review it. Thank you, sir. Brennan stepped out. He was not in a hurry. Paperwork always won. Whitfield learned about the transfer request from Hayashi, who had overheard it from a guard. The doctor found Brennan outside the medical tent. The conversation was brief and carried the weight of two men who understood each other's grief, but not each other's conclusions. Sergeant Brennan Tanaka is a medical patient under my care. She is recovering from a serious wound. With all respect, Lieutenant Security is my jurisdiction. She has an intelligence background. She operated a radio for 6 months before returning to medical duty. That is administrative reassignment, not intelligence training. The regulation does not distinguish, sir, and I have a duty to protect the security of this camp. Whitfield studied Brennan's face. For the first time, he saw not an adversary, but a father. A man whose son had been killed by the same empire that had trained the woman Whitfield was trying to protect. A man who carried his grief not in tears, but in triplicate forms and regulatory citations, because forms and citations did not bleed and could not die. Sergeant, I understand why you are doing this. Brennan stiffened. Sir, I lost someone too. My brother, Pearl Harbor, USS Arizona. Silence. Somewhere in the camp, a generator coughed and resumed its hum. But if I let that loss decide how I treat my patients, I would not deserve the oath I swore. Brennan looked at Whitfield for a long time. His face did not soften, but something behind his eyes shifted the way a door moves when the wind changes but does not open. An oath did not save my son, Lieutenant, he said quietly, and he walked away. The paperwork entered the system. And in the military system, once paperwork begins to move, only two things can stop it: an officer with higher authority or a miracle. What happened next was neither and both. A tropical storm hit Guam 3 days later. Wind tore across the camp at 100 kilometers per hour. Rain fell sideways. Tent poles snapped like bones. The medical tent where American wounded were recovering, separate from the prisoner compound, took a direct hit when a palm tree crashed through the roof. Billy Dawson was inside. The boy from Texas, the Marine whose intestines Fumiko had held in her hands on a moonlit rock in Saipan. His abdominal wound had been surgically repaired but had not fully healed. When the tree came through the canvas, a beam pinned him across the chest. The surgical sutures on his belly tore open. He began to bleed internally. The American nurses were evacuating patients from the other end of the tent. Whitfield was trapped on the far side of the camp by flooding. No one could reach Billy in time. Fumiko heard the screaming through the storm. English words she could not translate, but the sound was universal. The sound of a young man dying and knowing it. She was not authorized to leave the prisoner tent. Leaving meant violating camp regulations. It meant giving Brennan another line in his report. It meant risking everything Whitfield had fought to protect. But that sound she had heard before on rocks in the dark on Saipan when a boy with sandy hair had looked up at her and not understood why the enemy was saving him. Fumiko ran into the rain. Her feet slipped in the mud. Her thighs screamed. Wind tore at her clothes and her hair whipped across her face like wet rope. She found the collapsed tent by following the cries. Inside, Billy lay under the beam, his shirt soaking red, his face the color of old paper. "You," he whispered when he saw her. His eyes widened with recognition. The face from Saipan, the hands that had held his insides. "You are you." She did not understand the words. She understood the wound. The sutures had torn. Blood was pooling beneath him faster than his body could replace it. If she did not stop the bleeding within minutes, his heart would have nothing left to pump. She pressed gauze against the wound with both hands. She elevated his legs using a broken tent pole wedged under his knees. She maintained pressure constant, unyielding, her fingers going numb in the cold rain, her arms shaking with fatigue, her teeth clenched so hard her jaw ached. 10 minutes, 15, 20. The storm howled around them. Water ran in rivers across the tent floor, carrying blood in thin red streams toward the drainage ditch outside. Fumiko's world narrowed to the circle of gauze beneath her palms. Nothing existed beyond that circle. Not the war, not the camps, not the ocean between Japan and America. Only the wound and the pressure and the stubborn mechanical refusal to let go. When Whitfield and the medical team finally arrived, they found her kneeling beside Billy, soaked to the bone, both hands red to the wrists, trembling with cold and exhaustion, but still pressing, still holding. Whitfield knelt beside her. Through Hayashi rain streaming down both their faces, he said, "You saved him." For the second time. Fumiko looked up. Her eyes were bloodshot and her lips were blue, and her voice, when it came, carried no emotion except the flat certainty of someone stating a fact as obvious as gravity. "I am a nurse. That is my job." The next morning, Whitfield walked into the camp commander's office with a medical report detailing the incident. His handwriting was neat, his language precise, his recommendation clear. Prisoner Tanaka Fumiko, upon the destruction of the American medical tent by storm damage, voluntarily left the prisoner compound to provide emergency first aid to Corporal Billy Dawson, USMC. Her intervention preserved Corporal Dawson's life. I recommend denial of Master Sergeant Brennan's transfer request and formal recognition of prisoner Tanaka's medical action under the Geneva Convention Article 30 regarding prisoners performing medical duties. Billy Dawson, once conscious enough to hold a pen, wrote his own statement. "She saved me twice. Once on Saipan when the bombs were falling. Once in the storm when the tent came down. I owe her my life. If anyone wants to send her to an interrogation camp, they will have to go through me first." The captain read both reports. He looked at Brennan, he looked at Whitfield. "Transfer denied. Prisoner Tanaka will continue recovery here under medical supervision." Brennan stood at attention. He nodded, he walked out. But as he passed Whitfield in the doorway, he stopped. His voice was low enough that only the two of them could hear. "You think you are saving her. But the war is not over, Lieutenant, and kindness in wartime is a luxury no one can afford." Whitfield met his gaze. "Maybe, but I would rather go bankrupt on kindness than get rich on hatred." Brennan looked at him, and in that moment his face held no anger. Only an exhaustion so deep it seemed geological, the weariness of a man who had spent 2 years searching for a reason his son had died and found nothing in any regulation or report that could make the death make sense. He walked away. Roy Brennan was not a villain. He was a good man. That war had bent into a shape he no longer recognized when he looked in the mirror. In a different world, a world where Eddie Brennan had not died on a coral atoll at 20 years old, Roy Brennan might have been the kind of man who bought lemonade from children's stands and coached Little League on Saturday mornings. But war does not give anyone a different world. It gives you this world and forces you to choose. In the spring of 1945, Fumiko was transferred to Tripler General Hospital in Hawaii for long-term recovery. The war in Europe had ended on May 8th, but the Pacific still burned. The transport plane lifted from Guam's coral runway under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Fumiko sat by the window clutching a small packet of gauze that Meg O'Brien had pressed into her palm as a keepsake. Below the island shrank a patch of green swallowed by an ocean that stretched in every direction like a question with no answer. Whitfield sat across from her, writing in his small notebook. The light from the window cut across his face, showing lines she had not noticed before. He looked older, almost worn through. She studied him quietly. She thought of how he had knelt in the sand on Saipan, how his hands had been covered in her blood, how he had raised those hands in the sunlight to show they were empty. What kind of enemy saved a life he had been taught to despise? Before the plane landed, Whitfield spoke to her through Hayashi for the last time. His voice was steady, but there was something beneath it, a weight being set down rather than picked up. "You will be safe. Hawaii has good hospitals." Then he handed her a small book. An anatomy textbook in English, its cover worn soft from use. On the first page in handwriting that was thin and disciplined and deliberate, he had written, "For Fumiko, who already knew how to heal before I taught her." She took the book. Her fingers touched his for 1 second. Neither of them spoke. That was the last time Fumiko Tanaka saw James Whitfield in the flesh. But his shadow would follow her for 40 years through atomic fire and starvation and the ashes of Tokyo until the day she stood before a lecture hall and spoke the words he had taught her, not with language, but with his hands held open in the sun. And while Fumiko flew toward Hawaii, thousands of miles away in the desert of New Mexico, scientists at Los Alamos were putting the final touches on something that would change every rule of war forever. Fumiko's hometown Nagasaki sat on their list of targets, but she did not know, not yet. Tripoli General Hospital sat on the island of Oahu like a promise the military had made to itself. The buildings were temporary structures, spread across the base barracks, converted into wards corridors, smelling of fresh paint and disinfectant. Everything clean and functioning in a way that made Fumiko feel as though she had stepped through a door into a world running on different rules. The permanent hospital on Mauna Loa Ridge was still being built, its coral pink walls rising slowly against the Hawaiian sky, but even the temporary wards held more medical equipment than every hospital she had ever worked in combined. She had a bed with sheets that smelled of soap. She had a clipboard with her name on it. She had a schedule: morning vitals, medication at 8, bandage change at 10, physical therapy in the afternoon. Everything measured, everything recorded, everything cared for with the mechanical tenderness of a system designed to heal. She began reading Whitfield's anatomy textbook at night, tracing the diagrams with her finger, sounding out English words she could not pronounce. Heart, lung, artery, vein. The language of the body was the same in every country. Blood flowed the same direction. Bones broke along the same vault lines. Pain was pain, regardless of the flag that flew above the hospital where you screamed. During the day, she watched the American nurses and memorized their routines. She learned how they logged temperature on charts and how they calculated dosages and how they checked for signs of infection before infection arrived. On Saipan, medicine had been reaction. Here, medicine was anticipation. You did not wait for the wound to rot. You built a wall against the rot before it could begin. By July, she was strong enough to walk the ward without limping. By August, she was helping fold linens and organize supply carts, her hands working from instinct, while her mind absorbed every procedure she witnessed. The nurses had stopped treating her as a patient. They treated her as a colleague who happened to speak the wrong language. And then the world split open. On the morning of August 6, 1945, a single bomb fell on Hiroshima. The news moved through Tripler like a shock wave without sound. Fumiko heard it from a translator in the corridor, a young Nisei woman whose face had gone the color of ash. "One bomb," the woman said. "One city. Gone." Fumiko did not understand. No one understood. A single bomb that could erase a city was not a weapon. It was something else entirely. Something that did not yet have a name in any language she knew. 3 days later, August 9th, the second bomb, Nagasaki. Fumiko was rolling bandages in the supply room when the translator came again. This time the woman could barely speak. Her mouth moved twice before the words came out. "Tanaka-san, Nagasaki. The second bomb." The roll of gauze slipped from Fumiko's fingers. It hit the floor and unspooled slowly across the linoleum, unwinding in a long white ribbon, like a bandage with no wound to wrap. "My mother," Fumiko said, not a question. A prayer spoken to a god she was no longer certain existed. No one knew. The Red Cross had no lists yet. Communications with southern Japan were severed. The bomb had fallen at 11:02 in the morning, 3 days after Hiroshima, when Japan was already collapsing. The original target had been Kokura, but clouds had obscured the city. The plane had turned south. Nagasaki had been the backup. Her city, her mother's garden, her childhood. All of it reduced to a secondary target on a flight plan that changed because of weather. That night, Fumiko lay on her bed and stared at the ceiling. She remembered Nagasaki, the wooden house with the sliding doors, the garden where her mother grew chrysanthemums in clay pots, the sound of the streetcar climbing the hill toward the harbor, the smell of fish cooking in the evening smoke from charcoal grills, drifting through neighborhoods where everyone knew each other's names. All of that might now be shadow on stone. She had read nothing about the bomb's effects. She did not know about the flash that turned human bodies into outlines on walls, the firestorm that followed the black rain that fell for hours carrying poison into the water, and the sound and the lungs of everyone who breathed. She knew only the word gone, and the word was enough. During the day, she ate eggs and fruit in an American hospital. At night, she imagined her mother dying of thirst and rubble created by the same nation that was feeding her eggs. The contradiction was so vast it could not be held in a single mind. It had to be carried in two minds at once, one that understood mercy and one that understood destruction. And the space between them was where Fumiko lived now, balanced on a wire strung between gratitude and rage, between the hands that had saved her leg and the plane that had erased her city. She did not sleep for 3 nights. On the fourth night, she opened Whitfield's anatomy book and read the inscription until the letters blurred. For Fumiko, who already knew how to heal before I taught her mentis, she pressed her palm flat against the page as if she could absorb the words through her skin, and somewhere in the small hours of the morning, exhaustion pulled her under like a wave, and she slept. The order came in late May of 1946. Repatriation. The word sounded clean and official, a government word, a word for documents and stamps and lines of people waiting for permission to go home. In the ward, it landed like a fist against bone. Go home. After months of being fed and treated and watched in an orderly hospital that smelled of soap, they would be sent back to whatever was left of Japan. Fumiko received her clothing, plain fabric sturdy, stamped for returnees. She ran her fingers over the cloth. It was not a uniform. It was not a bandage. It was a statement. You are no longer a patient. You are someone else's problem now. At Honolulu Harbor, Red Cross workers handed out small parcels. Fumiko opened hers and stared. Soap, a toothbrush, powdered milk, crackers, gauze pads. A printed slip in Japanese and English that said she could present it to Allied personnel in case of illness during the journey. Nobody had ever handed her something and said, "This is for you for free because you might need it later." The feeling was almost more than she could bear. The ship smelled of diesel and salt and boiled coffee. The women were given bunks in a converted troop compartment. Canvas hammocks hung in rows like cocoons. The air below deck was warm and crowded, but to Fumiko, it still felt safe. Safe. The word she had learned from an American mouth and could not stop hearing in her own. The voyage took days. Time no longer moved in hours. It moved in checks, morning ration, temperature reading, roll call, and letters. The letters were the worst. A woman named Ko from Okinawa received word through the Red Cross that her younger sister had died in March. Not in battle, not in a bombing, starved. The official notice said malnutrition. Everyone knew what that meant. No one had food. No one could help. There were no reserves, no miracle drugs, no gauze. Ko did not scream. She did not collapse. She sat on her bunk and held the paper against her chest the way you hold a photograph of someone you will never see again. That quiet broke Fumiko more deeply than any sound the war had made. America had fed her peaches and eggs. Her people had been dying on the floor at home. On the fifth morning they saw it, land on the horizon, gray at first, then darker, then real. Japan. Yokohama Harbor appeared under a sky the color of old dishwater. Smoke still clung to parts of the port even though the fires had been cold for months. Cranes stood twisted against the clouds, like the skeletons of animals that had died standing up. Warehouses gaped open. Whole blocks were flattened, only foundations remaining like chalk outlines of streets that had been erased. Along the pier, a line of people waited. They were more bone than body, dressed in whatever cloth they had found. No one waved. No one cheered. They watched with eyes that had seen too much to expect anything from a ship. Fumiko walked down the gangway and felt people staring. She knew what they saw: a young woman with clean skin, a healthy face, a bandage wrapped with professional precision, American-issue clothing. They did not see the night she had shaken with fever, thinking she would die nameless in a cave. They did not see the doctor's raised hands in the sunlight. They only saw that she had lived when others had not. She wanted to hide. She was also ashamed of wanting to hide. She had survived. Was survival now something to be ashamed of? Name a clerk asked in Japanese. Place of origin, surviving family. Tanaka Fumiko, Nagasaki, my mother if she is alive. At the word Nagasaki, the clerk's eyes rose from the paper, a pause. Then he stamped her form and said quietly, I hope she is. The floor tilted under Fumiko's feet. She had known about Hiroshima, everyone on the ship had known. But Nagasaki had been hit too 3 days later when the war was already over in everything but paperwork. She had been in Saipan when it happened. She had heard nothing until Hawaii. Now the clerk's voice made it real in a way that radio reports and Red Cross bulletins had not. The train north to Tokyo took hours. Some cars had no windows. Benches were made from scrap wood. The tracks themselves had been repaired by occupation engineers working alongside Japanese crews, pulling 12 and 14-hour shifts to get food and people moving across a country that had been broken at the spine. The landscape outside the window alternated between normalcy and nightmare. Rice paddies, then sudden stretches of charred earth where villages had been. Piles of salvaged lumber where houses once stood. Laundry lines strung between surviving poles, clothes flapping in the wind like flags of an army that had nothing left to fight for. At Ueno Station, Fumiko stepped into a city that no longer looked like a city. Tokyo had been the heart of an empire. Now it was rubble organized into paths. The American B-29 firebombing raids had burned entire neighborhoods in single nights, wooden houses going up in sheets of flame. Where those neighborhoods had been, people had built shelters from tin and burned timber and sheet metal, scavenged from factories that no longer existed. Occupation troops were present, but not dominant. Jeeps moved slowly through streets that were no longer streets. Military police stood at corners, not pointing rifles, just watching. Some Japanese bowed out of habit. Others refused to look. Fumiko moved through this landscape like a ghost returning to a world that had died while she was away. She found her mother in the northeast quarter of Tokyo. The house that had been a house was now a skeleton of beams draped in cloth. Her mother had evacuated from Nagasaki before the bombing. Luck. The kind of luck that feels like cruelty because it chose you and not the family next door. Her mother was smaller than Fumiko remembered, older in a way that had nothing to do with years. Her cheeks were hollow. The skin on her hands was cracked and gray from washing in cold water. But her eyes were the same, sharp, present, alive. Fumiko, her mother whispered. Not a question, a proof of prayer. She crossed the dirt floor and placed both hands on her daughter's face. For a long moment, Fumiko could not breathe. The touch was familiar and unbearable at the same time. She had imagined this reunion 100 ways, and in every version she arrived broken, limping, feverish, in need of rescue. She had never imagined arriving strong, fed upright, with clean bandages and an American anatomy book in her pack. Her mother pulled back just far enough to look at her. Her gaze paused at the bandage on Fumiko's thigh. Something like relief and something like shame crossed her face in the same instant. You are whole, she whispered. I am whole, Fumiko said. Then the guilt hit so hard she had to sit down on the packed earth floor. They ate that night on the ground. Her mother shared everything she had, a little rice stretched with barley, watery soup from dried fish bones and greens. Fumiko forced herself to eat slowly, even though her body screamed for more. It was the smallest meal she had eaten in months, and it was still too much. Every swallow tasted like theft. I heard you were dead, her mother said softly. They said nurses on Saipan died with honor. They said that was better. I did not believe them. I told them you were stubborn. I said she will come back to me even if the emperor himself told her not to. Fumiko stared at the bowl in her hands. Her eyes burned. They lied to us, she whispered. Her mother did not answer right away. The wind pushed through the gaps in the wall, rattling a scrap of tin. Far off, someone was singing to a crying child. Finally, her mother said, yes, they lied to us. 6 simple words. Also the most dangerous words Fumiko had ever heard spoken aloud in Japanese. Because those words meant that everything, the posters, the orders, the cliffs, where mothers had jumped with their children, and all of it had been built on a lie. And if the lie was broken, then the shame of being alive was also broken. And if the shame was broken, then surviving was not cowardice. It was something else. Something that did not yet have a name. Her mother reached for her hand. Tell me everything. So Fumiko told her. She told her about Saipan, about the shell fragment in her thigh, about the sand that stuck in the wound, and the smell of her own blood turning sour. She told her about the Marines who surrounded them and the tall doctor with rolled sleeves and tired eyes. She told her how he knelt, how he raised both palms, how she thought he was about to violate her, and how she had tried to hit him, how he had cut her uniform not to hurt her, but to free the cloth from the torn flesh, how he had stopped her bleeding with steady hands and clean gauze. She told her about Guam, the white tents, the syringes, the women in crisp uniforms who hummed while they worked, the bowls of peach syrup. The first time someone said to her out loud, "You are safe." She told her about Hawaii, the hospital with real windows, the bed sheets that smelled of soap, the way an Iowa nurse had laughed when Fumiko rolled a bandage tighter than anyone expected. She told her about the book with the inscription on the first page written in handwriting she would recognize anywhere. Her mother's eyes filled as she listened. She did not interrupt. She did not recoil. When Fumiko finished, she waited for anger. How dare you accept kindness from them? How dare you live well while we starved? How dare you believe anything they said? Instead, her mother exhaled slowly the way you release a breath you have been holding for a year and said, then some of them remembered how to be human. That was all. Some of them remembered how to be human. Fumiko covered her face with both hands and wept. The years that followed moved in a rhythm of rebuilding. Tokyo smoldered and reconstructed itself one scrap at a time under the watch of soldiers wearing foreign uniforms. Food was rationed. Winters were cruel. Nothing was healed. Nothing was simple. But Fumiko worked. She found a position at a civilian hospital in Tokyo, a structure half intact concrete and half patchwork lumber, where the corridors smelled of boiled bandages and carbolic, and the windows were plastic sheeting where glass should have been. On the wall near the entrance, someone had hung a faded Red Cross flag beside a hand-painted sign in Japanese, "Do not hide fever. Report it. We can treat it." That sentence, "we can treat it," had not existed during the war. During the war, fever meant you worked through it or you died quietly, and no one wasted medicine on a body that was already failing. Now every morning, Fumiko boiled instruments, scrubbed her hands, and wrapped wounds the way the American nurses had taught her. Not the Saipan way, the Guam way, the Tripler way. With pressure to control bleeding, a drain for infection, capillary refill checked in the toes, logged on a clipboard. She had a clipboard now. She had a chart for each patient, order like the wards she had memorized on the other side of the ocean. Some older doctors watched her and said nothing. Others watched and frowned. One, a gray-haired surgeon who had treated officers in Manchuria, muttered once, "Since when does a girl from Nagasaki tell me how to dress a wound?" and walked away. But when infection rates dropped in his ward, he stopped muttering. Japan in 1947 did not hand white coats to women. Fumiko was classified as auxiliary medical staff. She could assist, clean, translate, comfort, and, in practice, do everything except sign the paperwork. But when a child came in with a deep gash on his calf from scavenging scrap metal, and his mother hovered with wringing hands, and the boy shook with pain and shock, it was Fumiko who held him. It was Fumiko who cleaned the wound. It was Fumiko who warned the supervising doctor, "If we do not irrigate properly, he will lose the leg. I have seen this. I have seen Americans save a leg this way." The doctor looked at her for a long second. Then he nodded. "Do it." Those moments made her breathe. Tokyo was still broken, but something was changing in the air. People had stopped speaking only in whispers. Before, if someone criticized the emperor, you pretended not to hear. Now you could hear people in line for ration tickets saying openly, "The generals lied to us. They told us we were winning even as the houses burned." And sometimes someone would say, "They told us Americans were monsters," and then lower their voice and add, "But my cousin's boy was wounded in Hiroshima, and an American medic gave him water." And you could answer, "Yes, I saw that too." And no one would report you. That was new. That was enormous. The first time Fumiko heard her own story repeated by someone else's mouth was in the winter of 1947. A woman brought her husband to the hospital. His hand was swollen with a red streak running up the forearm. Clear infection. The husband refused treatment. They could not pay. He did not want American medicine in his body. The woman leaned close to Fumiko and whispered, They say there was a nurse from Saipan who was taken by the Americans and they healed her leg for free. Is that true? Fumiko froze. The woman's eyes searched her face with the desperate intensity of someone who needs one fact to be real in order to survive. Is that true? For one breath, Fumiko saw herself from the outside. Not prisoner, not traitor, not someone who came back with round cheeks while neighbors starved. She saw herself as proof. Proof that the world was not exactly the way the military had said it was. Yes, she said quietly, it is true. The woman exhaled as though she had been holding her lungs shut for a year. Then treat him, please. And Fumiko did. That night, walking home through blacked-out streets where power was rationed by the hour, Fumiko understood the weight she carried. Her story was no longer private. It had become medicine of a different kind. And medicine, she now understood, was never neutral. Medicine could be resistance. Medicine could be repair. Medicine could be a way of saying, we refuse to die the way they told us to. By 1952, the occupation was ending. Japan was regaining its sovereignty. A new constitution was in place. Women could vote, and Fumiko wore a white coat with her own name stitched above the pocket. In the spring of that year, a letter arrived. Thin blue paper, American postage. It had traveled through the Red Cross forwarding office and arrived at the hospital looking as though it had crossed not just an ocean, but a lifetime. She almost did not open it, thinking it was a supply notice. When she did, her hands shook. Dear Fumiko, if this reaches you, it means the rumor I heard in Honolulu is true. You survived and became a nurse again. I am proud of that, though I do not claim any share in your strength. I am back in Chicago teaching at a hospital. Every time I see a patient walk again, I think of you. I never told you why I was in the Pacific. My brother Tommy died at Pearl Harbor, USS Arizona, December 7th. He wanted to be a doctor. Every wound I treated on an enemy, I treated for Tommy. That was how I kept him alive. Medicine, I once told you, makes people human again. It still does. Perhaps it always will. James Whitfield. At the bottom in smaller handwriting, a postscript. I have sent a case of penicillin through Red Cross medical channels to the hospital where you work. No sender name on the crate. But if you read this letter, you will know. Fumiko read the letter twice. 3 times. Her fingers traced the ink until the words blurred. The secret about Tommy. She understood now. The man who had saved her on a beach in Saipan had carried the most legitimate reason in the world to hate her. His brother had been killed by the empire she served. Every time Whitfield had bandaged a Japanese wound, he had fought a war inside himself that no medal could honor and no report could document. He had not saved her because she deserved saving. He had saved her because he refused to let the war decide who he was. And the penicillin, the drug she had once thought was legend, the miracle powder that had saved her leg on a ship crossing the Pacific, had been arriving at her hospital for months without a name attached. Patients had recovered. Infections had retreated. Lives had continued. And all of it traced back to a man on the other side of the ocean who had never stopped healing, even across the distance, even in silence. That evening, she stayed late at the hospital, reading the letter by lamplight. Outside, Tokyo hummed with a new kind of life. Streetcars, laughter, jazz leaking from a cafe that served American coffee. She thought about how the same nation that had dropped fire from the sky now sent textbooks, grain, and doctors. History was cruel and confusing, but sometimes it bent toward mercy in ways that could not be explained by politics, or strategy, or the cold mathematics of war. In the autumn of 1953, the Tokyo Medical Association invited Fumiko to speak at a small conference on post-war nursing and international cooperation. She almost refused. The idea of standing before men who still whispered the word traitor behind her back made her stomach clench. But her supervisor insisted. You saw something none of us saw. You understand both sides of medicine. The hall was small, paint peeling, chairs mismatched. A Red Cross banner hung crooked on one wall. When her name was called, Fumiko walked to the podium and felt her palms go damp. A translator stood beside her. She looked out at the faces, gray suits, tired eyes, skepticism worn like armor. I was a nurse on Saipan, she began in Japanese. I was captured. I thought capture meant the end of my honor. But the people I had been taught to hate treated my wounds. They saved my leg. They taught me to save others. A murmur moved through the audience like wind through tall grass. I do not tell you this to praise them. I tell you this because it forced me to ask what honor truly means. If we can destroy cities, we can also rebuild them. If we can kill, we can also heal. I have learned that mercy is not weakness. Mercy is strength practiced on purpose. The translator carried the words into English for the foreign observers in the back of the room. When she finished, the hall was silent. Then slowly a few hands clapped. It was not applause for performance. It was the cautious sound of people realizing they had permission to think differently about the world that had broken them. Afterward, a young intern approached her. He could not have been more than 20. His face still carried the softness of a boy who had not yet been worn down by residency. "Sensei," he said shyly, "my father died in Manila. I grew up hating the Americans. But your story," he hesitated, eyes lowered. "Perhaps I should study abroad. Learn what they know, then come back." Fumiko smiled. That would be the best kind of victory. That night she walked home along the Sumida River. The lights reflected on the water like strands of broken glass stitched back together. She thought of the letter folded in her pocket, the ink already fading. She thought of Whitfield somewhere across the ocean, and of all the people who would never know his name, but would still be healed by the medicine he had set in motion with two raised hands on a beach in 1944. Tokyo winter, 1984. Sunlight spilled through the windows of the university hospital, soft and cold as silk. Dr. Fumiko Tanaka moved slower now. Her hair was silver, her fingers stiff in the mornings, but her hands still remembered every tendon and every quiet pressure of gauze. Her students called her sensei and took notes quickly whenever she paused beside a patient's bed. They knew she was different from the other professors. She talked less about technique and more about presence. "Do not touch until you mean to heal," she told them. "Hands can lie. Patients feel it when they do." One afternoon after rounds, a young intern handed her a package from overseas. Inside was a photograph. A group of American doctors standing before a hospital in Chicago. Someone had written in shaky pen, "Tripler Honolulu 1945. Still remembering. Her chest tightened. Whitfield would be long retired by now, perhaps gone. But the handwriting was the same. Thin, disciplined, deliberate. The handwriting of a man who measured his words the way he measured his sutures, with care and without waste. She placed the photograph on her desk beside the anatomy book he had given her 40 years ago. The paper had yellowed. The binding was soft. But the inscription on the first page was still legible. "For Fumiko, who already knew how to heal before I taught her." Outside, snow began to fall on a city that had once been ash. That evening, her granddaughter visited after class. Yuki Tanaka was 22, a medical student in her third year, with her grandmother's steady hands and her grandfather's quiet stubbornness. She sat on the edge of the desk and swung her feet the way she had done since she was a child. "Grandmother," she said, "our ethics professor asked us a question today. What moment made you believe in medicine? What should I say?" Fumiko smiled, the kind of smile that takes 60 years to earn. "Say that you believe because someone believed in you first." Yuki tilted her head. "Like you, like him," Fumiko whispered, tapping the photograph. "A man I was taught to hate saved my life. He cut my uniform so I could walk again. He showed me that kindness can be a scalpel, sharp enough to cut away hatred." "An American," Yuki asked, "a doctor named Whitfield. He taught me the hardest lesson of all. That mercy is stronger than victory." They sat together for a long time, the hospital quiet around them, except for the steady hum of machines keeping people alive through another night. Finally, Fumiko said, "When you wear that white coat, remember this? War will end. Suffering will not. Your job is to end suffering wherever you find it. Enemy or friend does not matter. Pain is pain." Yuki nodded. The light of understanding crossed her face like dawn crossing water. Later alone, Fumiko looked at her own hands. The skin was thin now, the veins raised like rivers on a map. Hands that had once trembled with terror on a beach in Saipan now trembled only with age. She flexed them, slowly felt the ghost ache of the old wound in her thigh and smiled. Outside her window, Tokyo glowed. Neon, trains, voices, life. Japan had changed. The world had changed. But the lesson she carried had not. She whispered into the empty room. Kindness from an enemy is a terrible and beautiful thing. It destroys hatred, but in its place something stronger grows. Her voice faded into the hum of Tokyo's night, leaving only the quiet truth she had spent a lifetime proving. Dr. Fumiko Tanaka passed away in 1991 at the age of 71. She left behind 3 generations of doctors and nurses she had trained and a hospital ward that still bore her name above the door. Dr. Yuki Tanaka, her granddaughter, became a surgeon at Tokyo University Hospital. On her desk sits a worn anatomy textbook in English and a black and white photograph of American doctors she never met. Every year on August 9th, the anniversary of the Nagasaki bombing, she places a single white chrysanthemum beside the photograph and sits quietly for 5 minutes before beginning her shift. James Whitfield died in Chicago in 1987. In his will, he asked to be buried with the photograph of his brother Tommy in navy whites and a single roll of gauze, the smallest thing he ever held, the most powerful. Billy Dawson lived to 89 on his ranch outside San Antonio, Texas. Every year on July 7th, the anniversary of the Banzai charge at Saipan, he lit a candle and placed it beside a bowl of rice porridge on the kitchen table. When his grandson asked why, he said, "Because a Japanese woman saved my life twice, and I never got the chance to say thank you." Sachiko Mori returned to Japan in 1946. She never spoke publicly about her time as a prisoner. But in 1960, she opened an orphanage on the outskirts of Osaka. Above the gate, she hung a small wooden sign, "Every child deserves to live long enough to decide their own life." Fumiko sent the orphanage its first medical kit. The 2 women never spoke again. But the kit said enough. Roy Brennan died in 1971 in Ohio. In his wallet were 2 photographs. His son Eddie in uniform smiling the way 20-year-olds smile when they believe the war will be over by Christmas. And a folded copy of the medical report documenting that prisoner, Tanaka Fumiko, had saved the life of Corporal Billy Dawson, United States Marine Corps. He kept it not out of hatred, but because it reminded him that even the enemy could save a life, and that knowledge was both the most comforting and the most painful thing the war had left him. Real healing has nothing to do with borders or flags or the settling of scores. It is the steady, stubborn, unreasonable act of choosing compassion when the world expects cruelty. And in that choice, repeated across oceans and decades, in the silence between 2 people who never saw each other again, humanity endures.